I'm Annalise Toller.
And I'm Alice Mayer.
This is Crash Course World History, and today we'll be talking about the Cold War, more specifically Mikhail Gorbachev and the fall of the USSR.
Despite what this globe says, the USSR no longer exists, or as it at least is not formally named that.
But this globe also has places like Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and several other countries that just don't exist anymore. And before you complain about why we should get a new globe, much like the USSR, we are experiencing budget cuts.
If you're over the age of 30, you're probably pretty familiar with or lived through the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, also known as that one president who nailed the first nail in the coffin of Soviet socialism. Which, maybe yes, that little nickname is accurate, but first, let's take a closer look at Gorbachev himself before we condemn him for the decline of socialism.
He was born March 2nd, 1931, and was a communist from a very young age. At 15, he joined the Komsomol, or the Young Communist League. In 1952, when he was 21, he went to college and became a fully fledged member of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, also known as the CPSU.
Gorbachev continued climbing the communist ranks, being named the leader of the Regional Party Committee in 1970. And in 1971, he was named a member of the Central Party. And finally, in 1985, he became the General Secretary of the CPSU, which gave him large amounts of control over the USSR, since the government was controlled largely by the party.
His efforts to strengthen the system ultimately led to its downfall. What you have to understand is that Gorbachev came to power at a very, very difficult time. Let's go to the thought bubble. Wait, what do you mean we don't have a thought bubble? Stan! We don't have Stan either? Okay, just go to the picture slideshow then.
So, if you weren't aware already, and I really don't know how you could have missed this one, Cold War tensions were running high in the 1980s. The Sino-Soviet split had recently occurred, leaving some civilians paranoid about China and the border it shared with the Soviet Union. The economy was essentially a mess because of the intense nuclear arms race that had been happening between the Soviet Union and the United States. Because nothing says I'm much better than you by having more weapons capable of destroying the Earth, am I right?
Gorbachev had been elected General Secretary in 1985, coming to power during a time where reforms were greatly restricted by the Politburo, a CPSU committee consisting only of the highest Soviet elite. Unlike his predecessors Brezhnev and Andropov, Gorbachev decided to push for change within the government. He started the perestroika policy to reform the government by making it faster, cutting out redundant committees, and allowing multi-candidate elections. All of these led to the creation of a new Supreme Soviet that brought more legislative power than ever before. Needless to say, the CPSU members and conservative elite were not pleased by the changes, as it took power away from the Communist Party and started to ease it more towards a centralized government.
Perestroika was also meant to kickstart the economy by introducing limited private businesses. But the government got stuck in a limbo between a very strict state-controlled economy and a free market. Gorbachev settled for an awkward middle ground that had no real driving force, and the economy began to fail.
He also introduced glasnost in 1986, a policy that literally meant openness. This was to increase the discussion of Stalinistic crimes and to limit censorship. The combination of glasnost and perestroika led to more opposition to the government as the economy continued to crumble.
At the same time, Gorbachev began working with the West to ease Cold War tensions, which led to the signing of the INF Treaty, an agreement that helped take out an entire category of nuclear weapons from the United States and the Soviet Union's arsenals. In 1988, he withdrew 50,000 Soviet troops from Europe, leading to the CFE Treaty, which proposed equal limits on nuclear weapons in the two superpowers. So satellite countries began breaking away from the Soviet Union's influence, mostly unopposed by Gorbachev and the Communist Party. During this time, people both inside and outside the USSR saw Gorbachev as a reformer, who was focused on genuine political and economic change. That reminds me, it's time for the open letter. Annalise, take it away.
Time for the open letter. Dear Nikita Khrushchev. But first, let's see what's in the mystery crock. It's a Lego nuclear missile. Dear Khrushchev, you really did walk so Gorbachev could run. While he's well known for his groundbreaking policies such as glasnost and perestroika, you were the first to reduce censorship and openly denounce Stalinism. You both really tried to improve things for the Soviet citizens, and we must condemn you for it. However, You did increase Cold War tensions by installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, while he reduced tensions by carrying out various peace acts. But you're both special in your own ways.
You also met similar fates, with political opposition rising to an unbearable point. But it's important to remember that you ushered in an era of change and reform that might not have been possible otherwise. You really left a mark on Soviet socialism.
Best wishes,
Allison
and
and
Annalise.
Annalise.
It's also important to consider that Gorbachev did do some pretty bad stuff while in office. For example, he kept control of the Baltics despite numerous protests, including, wait for it, the 1989 Baltic Way. He also attempted to overrule Lithuania's claim to independence. But throughout all of this, he pledged not to use militaristic forces against the Baltic citizens and did hold that promise. Rampant inflation and low standards of living were a common issue all across the USSR, caused in part by his policy perestroika. Gorbachev existed in an extremely gray area, and you have to acknowledge both the harm that he did and the good.
Going into the 1990s, the Soviet Union had lost a lot of political power. The Berlin Wall had fallen, the Soviets had pulled out of Afghanistan, and the USSR had been plunged into an economic decline worse than the American Great Depression. Gorbachev really puts it best in his book of memoirs, creatively named Memoirs. I thought we could unite socialism and democracy and give socialism a second wind. But the totalitarian model had relied on dictatorship and violence, and I could see this was not acceptable to the people. I wanted to change the Soviet Union, not destroy it. I started too late to reform the party, and I waited too long to create a market economy.
In the end, his own country was still opposed to his leadership. A 1991 coup was launched to remove Gorbachev from power, but after only 3 days, it collapsed and crumbled. But that was nowhere near the end of political opposition against him. Many from the West thought the United States would intervene in the coup, but unknown to them, a debate was going on among Bush officials about Gorbachev's uselessness and usefulness, and if it was inevitable that his power would come to an end. They began to shift their support towards Boris Yeltsin, Gorbachev's political rival and the president of Russia. Seeing the power and support shift away from him and the amount of chaos and resentment on the street, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as the president of the Soviet Union in December of 1991.
Even after he stepped down, Gorbachev was still a very influential person who left a complicated legacy. In Russia today, many blame him for the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 2016, a close associate of Vladimir Putin, Russia's current president, insisted that Gorbachev is officially named a criminal for causing the downfall of the Soviet Union. Despite the cold feelings in his own country, many Western nations have much more fond feelings. Gorbachev was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990 for his work to end the Cold War, as well as being named Time Magazine's Man of the Decade for the 1980s.
His memoir, which was barely acknowledged in Russia, quickly became a bestseller in Germany. Many books have been written about Gorbachev, including 2 by a British Oxford historian and a French secretary of the Académie Française, both dedicated solely to his perestroika policies.
The impact of Gorbachev's leadership and reforms are still being felt today. The almost victory-like remembrance of Gorbachev in the West differs greatly from the resentment in the modern Russia government.
But no matter what feelings arise from Gorbachev's name, no one can deny that he took important steps in ending the Cold War and reforming a world superpower. Thanks for watching.